Section 8 on distribution. We have developed an economic theory of property based on efficient ownership. However, some critics of economics believe that property law should be based on distribution, not efficiency. Some people think that government should redistribute wealth from rich to poor for the sake of social justice, whereas other people think that government should avoid redistributing wealth, allowing individuals to receive all the rewards of their hard work, inventiveness, risk taking, and astute choice of parents. Like the rest of the population, economists disagree among themselves about redistributive ends. However, economists often agree about redistributive means. Given the end of redistribution, economists generally prefer to pursue it by the most efficient means. For each dollar value transferred from one group to another, a fraction of a dollar is typically used up, as for example, in administrative costs. The most efficient means of redistribution uses up the least value to accomplish the transfer. Chapter 1 illustrated this fact by the example of ice cream melting during its transfer across the desert from one oasis to another. Another example is the percentage of donations that a charity spends on administrative costs. Many economists believe that redistributive goals can be accomplished more efficiently in modern states by progressive taxation than by reshuffling property rights. Besides avoiding waste, more efficient redistribution generates more support from the people who must pay for it. If the economists are right, redistribution for social justice should focus mostly on taxation and expenditure, not property rights. Progressive taxation and expenditure is usually more efficient than reshuffling property rights to achieve redistribution for a variety of reasons. The most wasteful way to redistribute wealth is for courts to tilt trials in favor of the plaintiff or defendant, depending on who is poorer. If courts favor the poorer party in legal disputes, each person prefers to avoid interacting with the relatively poorer people whenever a lawsuit could arise. Thus, a person would want to avoid owning real estate in a neighborhood occupied by people who are poorer than he is. Similarly, favoring the poorer party in a contract dispute makes a person reluctant to do business with anyone who is poorer than he is. Several other reasons also make taxation superior to property law as a means of redistribution. First, the income tax precisely targets inequality, whereas property law relies on crude averages. To illustrate, suppose that the rule of law in a particular county in Montana is ranchers' rights. If ranchers are richer than farmers on average in this county, then changing the rule to farmers' rights would redistribute wealth towards greater equality. However, although ranchers are richer than farmers on average, some farmers are undoubtedly richer than some ranchers. Changing the property rights to favor farmers over ranchers will aggravate the inequality between the rich farmers and poor ranchers. In contrast, progressive taxation will ameliorate unequal incomes. A second objection is that reshuffling property rights may not really have the distributive effect anticipated. To illustrate, suppose that both farmers and ranchers rent their land from absentee owners. If property law shifts the cost of fencing from farmers to ranchers, competition among landlords may cause them to adjust rents to offset the change in costs. Specifically, the landlords who own farmland may increase the rent charged to farmers, and the landlords who own ranch land may decrease the rent charged to ranchers. Consequently, the reshuffling of property rights may not affect the distribution of wealth between farmers and ranchers. Instead, the landlords who own farms may gain, and the landlords who own ranches may lose. In general, any change in the value of land gets capitalized into rent. Consequently, the wealth effects of reshuffling property rights in a world with zero transaction costs tend to fall on the owners of land, not its users. Superscript 25. It reads, Professor Coase made in this argument in Notes on the Problem of Social Cost in The Firm, the Market, and the Law, 1988. In general, taxes and other government impositions finally fall on factors in relatively fixed supply, such as land. Back to the text. In addition, there is another reason for the relative inefficiency of redistribution by property law. Redistribution by property law distorts the economy more in the long run than does progressive taxation. For example, if property law favors farmers over ranchers, some rich ranchers may switch to farming to gain valuable legal rights. In contrast, a comprehensive income tax precludes people from reducing their tax liability by changing the source of their income. Superscript 26, it reads, A fundamental principle in public finance is that taxes distort less when applied to a broad base rather than to a narrow base. Distortion decreases with the breadth of the base because demand becomes less elastic. To illustrate, the demand for food is less elastic than the demand for vegetables, and the demand for vegetables is less elastic than the demand for carrots. Income is a very broad base. Back to the text. For these reasons and more, economists who favor redistribution and economists who oppose it can agree that property law is usually the wrong way to pursue distributive justice. Unfortunately, these facts are not appreciated by many lawyers who have not studied economics. Superscript 27, it reads, An important technical conclusion in formal welfare economics, the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics, reinforces the general point made in the text, namely that efficiency and equity are separable, with specific reference to property law. That conclusion can be read to say that property law should seek to allocate and enforce entitlements so that a society uses resources efficiently and should then use the tax and transfer system to achieve distributive equity. See, for example, Stephen Chevelle, a note on efficiency versus distributional equity in legal rulemaking. Should distributional equity matter given optimal income Taxation, 71 AM Econ REV dot 414, year 1981, and Lewis Kaplow and Stephen Chevelle, why the legal system is less efficient than the income tax in redistributing income. 23 J. Legal Study 667, year 1994. Back to the text. We have presented several reasons against basing property law on redistributive goals. Specifically, we discuss imprecise targeting, unpredictable consequences, high transaction costs, and large distortions in incentives. While the general principle of property law cannot rest on wealth redistribution, special kinds of redistributive laws can ameliorate these objections and blunt this criticism. An example is law requiring employers to construct buildings that provide access to people in wheelchairs. If properly designed, these laws can precisely target handicapped people in a predictable way. Enforcement by private legal action can be inexpensive, and the distortion in incentives can be modest. Designing such laws to produce these desirable outcomes, however, requires more careful attention to the underlying economics than regulators typically show.